Hi, I'm Billy Johnson, here doing our first podcast with all things Caldwell, kicking off on July the 4th. And thought, seeing how it's July 4th, we'd do a little history lesson talking about the events that led up to the Declaration of Independence. Specifically, how did 13 happy English colonies become one angry confederation of Americans that wanted to break away from their mother country? What caused this? What brought it about? Well, if you want to get real technical, it's all going to get started over land. Land is the only thing that matters because it's the only thing that lasts. See, North America at this time was divided between three major European powers. You've got the British along the Atlantic coast. The French control what we would now think of as Canada, from the Alleghenies over to about the Rockies. Then Spain controls from the Rockies down into Mexico, Florida, and Cuba. Now, as the European countries went to war, so did their colonies. So conflicts that didn't start in North America would also often find their way being fought over here. Well, in the French and Indian War, it's going to happen the other way. It's all going to get started, like I said, over land. In 1753, a young Virginian named George Washington, you may have heard of him, decided to get rich in land speculation. Think of it like flipping a house. We're going to buy land cheap, develop it, then sell it to settlers that want to move over the mountains into the fertile Ohio Valley River country. Washington buys land from the governor of Virginia, from the state colony, and then crosses over the mountains to go and survey his land. He wants to see what resources are there. He's never been there. He wants to explore it. Hey, how much can I charge for this? Well, when he gets there, he discovers something he didn't expect. There's a group of Frenchmen building a fort in the middle of George Washington's land. See, the French had realized the English settlers were beginning to come over the mountains into French territory. So they began a campaign or an idea of building a line of forts along the frontier, kind of like a picket fence, marking it, hey, here's our land, this is ours, that's yours. Well, Washington comes upon this party of Frenchmen building a fort, and he rides up to them and basically tries to explain, excuse me, you're in Virginia. I don't know where you think you are, but you're in Virginia, and this is my land. I've got this deed from the governor of Virginia, and it says this is mine. Well, the French commander was very polite. He's like, no, you are not. You are in New France. This is my land. Well, this piece of paper says it belongs to me. These 25 soldiers say it belongs to me. I win. Washington actually spent the night with the French, and then they sent him on his way back over to Virginia. Washington rides to the governor and explains to the governor, we got a problem. Or you've got a problem. I need either my money back for the land I bought, or you need to do something about these Frenchmen who are building a fort in the middle of Virginia. Governor DeWitt says, no, we're not going to allow this. You go handle it. I'll tell you what. I'll make you a colonel of the militia. You raise a militia force, go over the mountains, and make the French leave. Well, this appealed to Washington because Washington had always wanted to have a career in the military, and now he was getting an opportunity of it. Washington raises a militia group. They cross over the Alleghenies. They attack the French in what will be later known as the Battle of the Great Meadows, and they defeat the French and they drive them off. They take over the fort, rename it Fort Necessity, and begin to finish construction on the fort. Well, the French just weren't going to take this lying down. Word spread. The French also called in their Indian allies. See, because the French didn't have a great population, what they did was they used the various native tribes that were allied with the French like a force multiplier. Okay, when you went to war against the French in North America, you didn't fight 500 Frenchmen. You fought 500 Frenchmen and all the Huron and all the Abenaki and all the Delaware and all the other various tribes that showed up to back them up. Well, the French began to call in their Indian allies. 1754, the French show back up. They attack Washington at Fort Necessity, and they drive Washington out. He falls back over the mountains. The French take over the fort. Vive la France. Everything is fantastic. Well, by the time Washington gets back, word is starting to spread about tension in North America. And the British send one of their best generals, Edwin Braddock, with some British regulars, British redcoats, over to North America to handle the situation. Now, Braddock's good. Braddock's so good, he'll tell you how good he is. This man is undefeated in Europe. Fighting in Europe, he is the man. He's never lost a major battle. The problem for Braddock is he's not fighting in Europe, he's fighting in North America. And his idea of war and what the French and the Indians' idea of war are all different types of war. Braddock brings together a British force, commissions Washington to raise more militia. And then this combined militia and British force begins to head over the Alleghenies to what was Fort Necessity, now known as Fort Duquesne. The thing is, the British bring everything with them. When I mean everything, I mean everything. It's a baggage train, extra clothes, a dining room set, because we can't sit on the ground, for God's sakes. We're English. No, no, no. We'll drink tea here. Yes. They bring all this stuff with them, but there are no roads. So as Braddock's army is moving through the wilderness, they're chopping down trees, splitting the trees, and making what's called a corduroy road. The thing is, this takes time. And it's not real quiet. You've got hundreds of men with the sound of axes hacking and chopping and ringing through the woods. This carries. And the Indians are watching. The Indians take word back over the mountain to the French. Hey, the English are coming. And the French are like, oh, they are. We will be waiting for them. Send word. Get more Frenchmen. Gather more Indians. The French and Indians gather so quickly at Fort Duquesne, they almost run out of food. Braddock's advance is so slow getting there, the French almost have to disband their army and send everybody home because they don't have anything to eat. No, the English will be here eventually, and we will fight them when they get here. Washington is trying to tell Braddock, excuse me, we need to speed up and get there. And Braddock's like, no, we're fine. We're building a road through the wilderness. We're going to need a road anyway, because after we get there, we're going to want to go back and come back and forth. So we've got to build a road anyway. Might as well build the road now. I mean, we're here. Well, Braddock, in his arrogance, doesn't watch his flanks. He doesn't send troops out. And he wanders into what we know as the Battle of the Wilderness. Basically, he walks into an ambush. He gets hit from three sides by French and Indian troops. Braddock, while not the greatest general in North America, is brave. He does get shot leading his troops, shot through the stomach. He's actually going to bleed to death over about 5 days in the back of one of his wagons, bumping his way back down that corduroy road that they made. Washington shows that he is a skilled commander because he extracts an outnumbered force from an ambush and actually puts up a good rear guard defense, and the British and the Americans actually get out of the trap because of George Washington. One of the things he will show is Washington does understand how to keep a group of men together, and this will help the Americans greatly during the American Revolution. Conflict is starting to build. The French realize what's going on, and they decide to do something that seemed wise at the time, but wasn't long term. The French pulled troops out of all their colonies all over the world: India, Africa, Asia, South America, the Sugar Islands, which we now call the West Indies. And they send all these French troops to New France. The French think this war is just going to be a North American colonial skirmish, and they're going to win it. The British, thanks to their spy network, realize the French are pulling thousands of troops out of everywhere else in the world and shipping them to New France, what we now call Canada. And the British Army, instead of stopping them at sea, just kind of steps over to the side, and you just go right on into Canada. After the French unload their army, the British put a blockade on North America. They basically trap the French army in New France. The British send over some more regulars, but they go to the Americans and say, okay, we've got an idea here. If this works, it's going to be great. You guys hold tight here. Don't get killed. We're going to go take the war to France. We're going to attack them in Europe. We're going to attack them in North Africa, Asia, Asia Minor. We're going everywhere. India, it's going to be a world tour of England. Stay alive till we get back. Good luck. And the British leave. They leave 13 American colonies, which don't like each other very much. That's why there's 13 of them, to deal with the French. And what happens is, it's the first time the colonies are forced to work together. Benjamin Franklin calls for something called the Albany Congress and the Albany Plan of Unity. First political cartoon in American history. It's the snake chopped up and it says, join or die. Snake was the symbol of the North American colonies. Not the eagle, but the snake. And he's saying, if we 13 colonies, actually at that time it was 12, don't put our differences aside, we're going to get overrun by the French and their Indian allies. Well, the Albany Plan doesn't work because the New England colonies can't all get on the same page. But what it does is it organizes regional militia armies backed up with British regulars. And eventually the Americans and a handful of British regulars begin to take the fight to the French. Nova Scotia falls, Montreal falls, and finally at the Battle of Quebec, New France is defeated. By 1760, the fighting in North America between the British and the French is pretty much over. Now, it will stretch on worldwide, because what we call the French and Indian War, everywhere else calls the 7 Years' War. And it's technically the first worldwide war in history. But the Americans see an opportunity. The French have never really been the problem. The problem's been the Indians that backed them up. Now, I'm speaking from an American colonial point of view. They look at the Indians like we would look at ISIS. They don't understand these people. And when we fight them, it's nasty. It's a fight to the death. And the reason why we've never been able to take care of these people, so to speak, is because the French have always been there to back them up. You could attack the Indians, drive them into the woods, but they would just fall back. The French would feed them. The French would rearm them. The French would send them back out. Except the French are gone. And the American colonists look around and realize they don't have any help. It's time to end this. And the American colonists began a full-on campaign of clearing areas, what we would now basically call ethnic cleansing, of Indian tribes. They got to go. Either we're going to live on this land or they're going to live on this land. Once again, I'm speaking as an American of that time period, but this is how they looked at it. And we do. We rip into the Indians and start to drive them back farther and farther west, farther and farther north. By 1763, the war is pretty much over. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, France gives what we now call Canada to Britain. Spain gets what would become Louisiana. England gets Florida, but they give Cuba back to Spain. The Americans are excited. We've won, because this whole war was over land. That's what it got started with. They even paid American colonial troops. They didn't have cash to pay them. They paid them in land grants. You fight, when the war's over, we'll give you land in the West. But then King George's government does something that no one understands. He issues the Proclamation of 1763, which tells the Americans, you can't move west of the Allegheny Mountains. The land you fought for the last 7 years, the land that you went into the woods and had to fight people for, the land we promised you, you can't have. This angered a lot of Americans. What made it worse was the British Army finally comes back after conquering parts of the rest of the world for Britain, and they keep the Americans from finishing off the Indians. Think about it. We've been fighting the Hurons for years. We finally got them down. We're about to stick this Huron. He's not going to crawl into my window at night. He's not going to threaten my wife. He's not going to threaten my children. The British Army, our army, shows up, and we're like, yeah, the Army's here. And right as we're about to win, the Army goes, stop that. Stop that right now. Quit harassing that poor Indian. Get off of him. What do you mean, get off of him? Why don't you hold him while I stick him? No, we're not going to do that. We're going to make peace with the Indians. What? Peace. We can't constantly be at war. No, we can't. If we'll kill him, we won't be at war with him anymore. The American point of view. But the British government wanted peace. See, the 7 Years' War cost a lot of money. And while Britain made huge territorial gains, they gained control of India, they gained control of Egypt, all these different places around the world. It cost a lot of money, and now we've got to pay for the war. And one of the ways the British want to make money is they want to trade with the Indians. We can't trade with the Indians if our colonists are shooting at them and sticking them with knives. So in the interest of commerce, in the interest of revenue, our own government cuts a deal with the people we considered our enemy. To say the least, this made a lot of Americans very angry, because the whole war had been about land. And now our own government will not let us move into the land they promised us. All right. Well, the 7 Years' War cost the British a great deal of pound sterling. And like most governments, they need to raise revenue. The first idea is, let's raise taxes. So the British look around and go, all right, well, we'd fought this war. Now the Americans need to pay for it. Yes. So they're going to come up with a whole string of taxes and ideas to generate revenue. And the first thing they're going to come out with in 1764 is known as the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act specifically should have been called more accurately the Rum Act, because that's what it was named after. See, the New England colonies were making a lot of money in what was called the triangle trade. You take molasses, which comes from the trees, the syrup, the maple syrup from New England, run it down to Jamaica, have it turned into rum. The rum gets run over to Africa. In Africa, you pick up slaves, bring them back to Jamaica, sell that, carry it back up for sugar, carry the sugar to New England, turn to rum. The triangle trade in the New England colonies were making a great amount of money over this. But England wasn't getting a piece of the action because none of it was going to Britain. And Britain only had the power to tax what came to Britain. They couldn't put duties and fees and tariffs on stuff that didn't come through the UK. So the British were like, oh, no, we need a piece of that revenue stream. There's money over there, and we're not getting our fair share. And after all, we just fought this war and saved the Americans, so they need to pay us. That's all there is to it. Well, the Sugar Act really hit the New England colonies and angered them, but it didn't hit the middle and the lower colonies. But what's going to happen next to generate revenue is going to hit everybody, the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act was this brilliant idea that we're going to tax any printed piece of paper, anything, legal documents. You have a will, they're going to tax your will. You have a newspaper, they're going to tax that. Want to read a book? There's a tax on that. Y'all, if you had toilet paper that had a printed design on it, and they had to have it back then, they taxed that. Everybody needs this, we'll tax this. Not everybody's drinking rum, everybody's using toilet paper. This is a moneymaker, cha-ching, England. Well, the problem is, England didn't have the authority to tax us. See, in the English Constitution, it says there shall be no taxation without representation. In other words, if the people do not have a voice in Parliament, you can't tax them. This is why England had a parliament. That's why Scotland had a parliament. That's why Northern Ireland has a parliament. They have a voice. Therefore, if they have a voice, they can legally be taxed. But the American colonies had no voice in the British government. They had limited self-rule here. But this revenue wasn't staying in the colonies. This money was being sent back to Britain. And the Americans began to go, excuse me, you can't do this. On top of this also, the British, in order to save money, came up with something called the Quartering Act. You get to keep and take care of a redcoat yourself. That's right. The British Army wanted to save money on feeding and quartering troops. So what they did was they moved a redcoat into your house. They don't reimburse you for this. They think that as a British subject, it's your duty to pay for the army because the army is here protecting you. If it wasn't for us, you'd be overrun. We're protecting you from the Indians. Well, the Americans' idea was, no, you're protecting the Indians from us. We had this. When you guys in your nice red coats got on your ships and went to India, we handled this. We beat the French. We took out the Indians. We were winning when you stopped us. So now you want us to pay for you to stay here to keep us from moving on to the land we were promised. Not only do we not get the land, but now we have to pay for the army that's keeping us from going and living on it in the first place. This begins to build some resentment in the colonies. The colonies began to mount protests. The various colonial legislatures going, excuse me, you can't tax us. And finally, the Pennsylvania legislature said, well, who was considered the most intelligent man in America at the time, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, to Parliament. Franklin went to Parliament and read the English Constitution to the English government. Funny how governments can sometimes forget the very constitutions they're based on. But Franklin read it to them and said, this says you cannot tax Englishmen without allowing them representation in Parliament. None of the 13 colonies have representation in this body. Therefore, all these taxes you have levied on us are illegal. You cannot tax us without allowing us representation. Let me also tell you this. Franklin was told before he got sent over, under no circumstances do you cut a deal and accept representation. You understand? We're going to use this to get the taxes off of us. If they come to you and say, okay, well, we'll give you seats at Parliament, keep paying the taxes, the Americans are going to be like, oh, no, that's okay. We don't want that. We just want the taxes off. The English hear Franklin's point of view and are like, oh, I believe he's right. We can't tax them. Look at that. Well, these taxes are illegal. Take the taxes off. And they did. They rescinded the taxes. The Americans were like, yes, way to go, Franklin. You explained it. Franklin's like, thank you. Thank you very much. Franklin leaves and goes back to the United States. The next year, the British amend their Constitution to do what? To allow them to tax the colonies. We showed them what they were doing is illegal, and they're like, oh, you're right, it is illegal, we're going to stop. But then the very next year, they changed the laws to make the taxes legal, then impose the taxes back on us. You see how the Americans might start getting a little upset about all this? On top of this, the Americans now begin like, well, we're just not going to buy British goods. We'll buy from somebody else. See, we forget, y'all, just about where you think Kentucky, Tennessee, that area is, that starts another country. That's Spain now. Spain will be happy to sell Americans goods. And you don't have to buy from England. You can buy from Spain. You got to keep it quiet. Shh, don't tell anybody. You can buy tin goods from Britain that are highly taxed. You can buy the exact same tin good from the Spanish that's considerably cheaper. So the American colonies began very quiet, very illegal trade with the Spanish from Cuba and Louisiana. Well, this cuts into the British revenue stream again. The British are like, wait a minute, you can't go trade with them. You've got to trade with us. This is costing us money. Make them stop. So the British send more troops to North America to enforce the tax laws, which means more Americans have more redcoats living in their house, which makes more Americans angry about the tax laws and the British troops. Not only am I being forced to pay a higher price for goods, I'm having to pay for the man who's here to enforce that law on me. Thanks, my government. I appreciate that. Resentment begins to build. This is going to lead up to a group of guys from the New England area called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty spring up in the New England area, specifically in Boston, mostly by men who were making money in shipping, merchant shippers, people like that, who were really feeling the bite of the British taxes. Everybody was upset about quartering redcoats. But in New England, because of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and all the other taxes that were aimed specifically at colonial shipping, the British were taking an even bigger bite out of everybody's paycheck than in the other colonies. And the Sons of Liberty began pointing out, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. Why are we paying all these taxes? Why are we paying for an army that's not protecting us? We're paying an army that's suppressing us. This isn't right. We're Englishmen. Remember that idea. We're Englishmen. We have rights under the English Constitution, and our government is abusing us. Well, things began to calm down a little bit. Then we enter a man named Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is basically the treasurer of England. Townshend realizes England's broke. There's no money. But we've got to keep the Navy and we've got to keep the Army because we've got this worldwide empire now. And if you don't have a Navy and you don't have an Army, specifically a Navy, you can't protect it. So we've got to raise more revenue. So he comes up with something called the Townshend Acts, which is going to put a tax on all imports going in to the colonies. This hits everybody from Georgia to Massachusetts. Remember, at that time, Maine was part of Massachusetts. Everybody gets this tax. This tax doesn't just hurt New England shippers and distillers. This tax hits everybody. Exports and imports are being taxed. If you ship it out of America to sell it anywhere else, the British get a piece of your money. They cut into your profits. And here's the thing. Undue tax burdens always kill the economy. The money people would spend on discretionary items, there's what we have to pay for and what we want, what we need and what we want. The average colonial doesn't have the money for his wants. All of a sudden, what industry there is isn't able to sell their goods, so it begins to shut down. Unemployment becomes a problem. And it's because of this massive tax burden that our government is placing on us. Our own government is killing the economy with taxes. And they won't listen to people that say, wait a minute, what we need to do is lessen the actual burden per person, but tax more people. Instead of taxing a handful of people at 50% of their income, let's tax everybody at 5%. But they don't want to hear this because they want revenue now. We've got to have cash now to pay for our expenses of the government. And this begins to turn the Sons of Liberty from just a group of New England hotheads mad because they're having to pay taxes on rum to a continental-wide movement for freedom. People begin to ask questions. What do we pay England for? We fought the French. We fought the Indians. What do the British do other than live in our houses and eat our food? Why do we need Britain, and why are we paying these people to be here to suppress us? Resentment begins to grow. The Boston Massacre occurs, 1750. Y'all, the British, in the case of the Boston Massacre, weren't in the wrong. It gets started with a bunch of little boys who think it's cute to throw snowballs at redcoats. Then the snowballs have rocks in them. Then somebody gets the idea to take the snowball, pour water on them, set them outside, let them freeze, and let's hit the British with ice balls. Well, eventually after dark, the kids went home, but the Sons of Liberty were hanging out, and they start throwing stuff at the redcoats. No one's sure exactly what happened, but they believe what happened was somebody threw a piece of firewood. When it hit the British sergeant in the head, he said something about firewood. And the British soldiers who had been standing there for hours, being pelted with everything, heard the word they wanted to hear, fire. And they opened up on the crowd. They're actually arrested, put in jail, and tried for murder. And John Adams, future President of the United States, defends the British troops. But what Adams does is brilliant. He doesn't say, his whole defense is, these English soldiers aren't to blame. They're just following orders. The true culprit is the government that sent them here in the first place. Yeah, most redcoats were low-born people, illiterate. They just followed orders. You don't blame the redcoat. Blame the man who sent the orders. Blame King George. That's who sent them, and that's who should be on trial. And John Adams takes this whole murder trial and turns it into a discussion of why are they here in the first place? They shouldn't be here, and they certainly should be living in our house, eating our food, and drinking our tea. Tea. When Britain took over India, they took over all these tea plantations that the French had had. The British East India Company begins to produce massive amounts of tea. What happens, though, is they flood the market. There's so much tea that supply is greater than demand. And when supply is greater than demand, the price falls. And the British East India Company realizes we grew too much tea. We've got to do something. We're about to take a huge loss. There's no way we can sell all this tea. So the British East India Company goes to Parliament and says, hey, you know, we contribute a lot of money to you people. So the British government steps in and they begin to subsidize tea production, making it cheaper for tea being sold by the British East India Company to be imported to America and be sold here. This cuts the throat of American businessmen, people that were already bringing tea in. Now our government is forcing us to sell a product at a lower price because it's being subsidized with our tax money, and it's hurting American industry, American business, American commerce. And the Americans begin to get really upset about this. Now, the British tried to land these tea ships several places. Charleston, the South Carolinians just refused to even unload the boats. They tried in Philadelphia. The Pennsylvanians were like, no, you're not coming in here. They tried in New York. They didn't go there. They finally land in Boston, of all places. The British East India Company, whether by accident or on purpose, tied up at a wharf right next to a tavern that the Sons of Liberty would get drunk at regularly and sit around and complain about the British government. And what's sitting out here on the wharf right in front of where they get drunk but the symbol at that time of government oppression, a ship full of tea. So finally, they just have had enough. Our government won't let us live on our land. Our government's taxing us to pay for a military that's sleeping and staying in our house and eating our food, keeping us from moving on the land that we were promised. And now, after excessive taxes, they're going to force us to buy a product that's going to put other American businesses out of work. It's going to shut down other American businesses. And so on the night of December 16th, a group of Sons of Liberty, dressed up like Indians, they weren't fooling anybody, rushed down and began to dump chest of tea into Boston Harbor, the Boston Tea Party. Now, here's something a lot of people don't realize. The happiest people that night was the British East India Company. They had insured the tea. And when all the tea got dumped into Boston Harbor, they were able to turn around and make a claim for the loss of the product on the insurance company. They were fantastic with it. They're like, thank you, Sons of Liberty. Unfortunately, they made King George angry because he was the one who told us, no, you'll buy the tea. And we're like, no, we won't. And Boston, no, we won't. So here we go. They decided they're going to punish Boston. They put in what's known as the coercive acts. The Americans call them intolerable acts. They come in and they restrict the importation of food into Boston and Massachusetts. The British wanted to punish a handful of Americans who got drunk, dressed up like Indians, and dumped tea into Boston Harbor. Who they actually punished was everybody living in the colony of Massachusetts. Women, children, men who had nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party all of a sudden can't buy food because you can't import it into Boston Harbor because Boston Harbor is shut down. And this would have just been a Boston, Massachusetts problem. But the other colonies said, wait a minute. If they can do this to Massachusetts, they can do it to us. Yeah, maybe South Carolina's not feeling the pinch. They're not messing with Georgia yet. But if we allow our government to do this to one colony, it sets the precedent where they can do it to all of us. And they call the First Continental Congress in 1774. Everybody gets together. They talk a lot. That happens in democracies. They talk a lot. They decide, hey, we're going to put forth a unified front. We're going to begin to boycott British goods. We're not going to work with the British government. We're going to try to resist where we can. And this also begins talk of, okay, what if they try to make us do this? What do you mean make us? Well, they've got an army here. Their army lives amongst us. What if our government tries to use our army against us? What are we going to do about it? And quietly, colonial militias begin to organize. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's broadcasting it. They don't run around. But civilians begin to buy more and more powder, more and more shot. Arms production begins actually in North America. Until then, we imported almost all our weapons. Our weapons were special made. Now we're starting to mold musket balls. Now we're starting to grind powder here because people can see the problem coming. Things continue to get hotter and more heated in Massachusetts. 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets. They begin to protest, writing letters to England saying, hey, this isn't right. You do not have the power to tax us. These taxes are illegal. And it's all going to come to a head. April 19, 1775. A group of British troops were ordered to leave Boston and go north toward Concord, where the Americans had begun to mold bullets and grind and make black powder. They were going to confiscate the powder works, destroy the musket balls, arrest John Adams, who was supposed to be in the area, and other known troublemakers. Fortunately for the Americans, a group of Sons of Liberty were on watch that night. And several of them took off, Paul Revere being one of them, Prescott and Samuel Dawes. And they carried the word throughout New England that the regulars were out. The interesting thing, they didn't yell the British were coming because everybody considered themselves to be British. Until this day, if you ask somebody living in Massachusetts what they were, they tell you, I'm British. You ask somebody living in Georgia, I'm British. 13 British colonies. The problem is the government pushed the colonies to the point that the people had no choice but to rise in rebellion. And that's how 13 very happy British colonies became one united American Confederation fighting for freedom.